I dug a shovel into my backyard to plant flowers for a garden my husband never got to finish. Instead, the shovel hit metal. Inside a rusted tin box, wrapped in rotted cloth, were coins caked in 50 years of dirt. I carried them to a small antique shop in town, and the owner gave me $60 for the whole box. 3 days later, my phone rang. "Ma'am," he said, his voice shaking, "you need to come back right now." When I walked through his door, 2 men in dark suits were waiting for me, and what they told me that afternoon changed the rest of my life. Welcome to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate again, and I'm so happy you're here with me. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. My name is Eleanor Ashby, though almost everyone in Larkspur Hollow, Tennessee, has called me Nora since I was a girl running barefoot through my grandmother's cornfield. I was 56 that spring when a shovel and a small flower bed rearranged the entire shape of my life. Before that spring, I would have told you I was nobody remarkable. A woman who worked 3 days a week at Bloom and Root, the garden nursery on Route 9, who baked too much banana bread, and who had been married to the same steady, quiet man for 31 years. Michael Ashby was a landscape architect, the kind of man who noticed the exact moment daffodils pushed through frost, and who could tell you the age of an oak tree by the pattern of its bark. He designed gardens for half the wealthy homes in 3 counties, though our own backyard, ironically, had sat half-finished for years, a patchwork of half-built stone borders, and a sketch he kept taped to the refrigerator titled, in his neat architect's handwriting, Nora's Butterfly Garden. He always said he'd finish it once the Wickham estate job wrapped up. He never got the chance. We had met at a county fair when I was 24, both of us reaching for the same jar of honey at a farmer's stand, and he'd insisted on buying it for me before I'd even said my name. 31 years is a long time to share a house with someone, long enough that you stop noticing the small kindnesses because they've become the air you breathe. He left notes in my coat pockets for no reason at all. He learned to make my mother's cornbread recipe after she passed, just so the smell of it wouldn't disappear from our kitchen. People in town used to joke that Michael Ashby was the only man in 3 counties who still opened the car door for his own wife after 3 decades of marriage, and it was true, and I never once told him how much that small thing meant to me, because I assumed, the way you always assume, that there would be time enough to say it later. Michael was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 14 months before he died. We fought it the way people fight these things, with hope stacked carefully on top of fear, with good days that fooled us and bad days that told the truth. He passed on a rainy Tuesday in October, in the hospice bed we'd set up in our own living room, with his hand in mine and the porch light on outside because he'd always hated the dark. I was left, 5 months later, in a house that felt enormous and silent, with a sketch of a garden still taped to the refrigerator that I could not bring myself to throw away. What I did not fully understand until I sat down with our accountant, a patient man named Roger Pell who had done our taxes for a decade, was how much the illness had cost us. Michael's landscaping business had covered the mortgage for years, but treatments, specialists, and the months he couldn't work had eaten through our savings and then some. There was a home equity loan I hadn't known the full size of, taken out quietly during a particularly frightening stretch of his treatment, and 2 medical collection notices that arrived within a week of each other that spring. My part-time hours at the nursery covered groceries and the electric bill. They did not cover much else. I want to be honest about the state I was in that April. I was not sleeping well. I would wake at 4 in the morning and lie there doing arithmetic in my head, the kind of arithmetic that never came out even. I was behind on the property taxes by 1 full cycle, with a second one approaching. I had started selling things quietly, the way people do when they are ashamed of needing to. Michael's truck, a set of hand tools he'd kept in pristine condition, a ring my mother had left me that I told myself I would buy back one day, though I knew even as I said it that I wouldn't. My daughter, Callie, was living 3 states away by then, finishing a graduate program and carrying her own student loans, and I made a point of never telling her exactly how bad things had gotten. She called every Sunday, and every Sunday I told her I was managing fine, that the nursery kept me busy, that I was doing all right on my own. It wasn't entirely a lie. I was managing, the way a person manages a slow leak in a boat, bailing just enough water to keep from sinking, never quite getting ahead of it. I didn't want her cutting her program short to come home and worry over me, so I kept the worst of it folded up small, tucked away the same way I tucked away Michael's sketch on the refrigerator, something I looked at every day and never spoke about out loud. It was on one of those low mornings, a Saturday in late April, that I decided to finally start the butterfly garden. I don't fully know why. Grief does strange things to a person's hands. Sometimes they need to move even when the mind has nowhere to go. I found Michael's sketch, measured out the bed exactly the way he'd drawn it along the eastern fence line, and started digging. The soil in that corner of the yard was harder than the rest, packed down and stubborn, and about 2 feet down my shovel struck something that was not a rock. It made a dull, metallic sound, and I remember kneeling in the dirt and clearing it away with my bare hands, my heart picking up speed for no reason I could name. What I uncovered was a tin box, roughly the size of a large shoebox, badly rusted along the seams, wrapped in what had once been a canvas sack and had long since rotted into brittle threads. I sat back on my heels in that half-dug flower bed and stared at it for a long moment before I worked up the nerve to open it. The lid resisted, then gave with a groan of old metal, and inside, nested in disintegrating cloth, were coins. Dozens of them, some dull silver, some a deep tarnished gold, some copper gone nearly black with age. There was no note, no explanation, nothing to tell me where they had come from, or who had buried them there, in a yard I had lived beside for 3 decades without ever knowing what lay 2 feet beneath the surface. I want to tell you I felt some flicker of destiny in that moment, some instinct that told me these coins were more than they appeared to be. I didn't. I felt tired and a little unsettled, the way you feel finding a stranger's belongings in a place that's supposed to be entirely your own. Mostly, if I am telling the truth, I felt the property tax bill sitting on my kitchen counter, and I thought, distantly, that these might be worth something to the right buyer. I carried the tin box inside and set it on the kitchen table, where it sat for 2 full days before I did anything about it. I remember running my thumb over the raised edges of one of the coins, wondering whether Michael would have known instantly what he was looking at, whether he would have called one of his gardening clients who collected old things, whether he would have laughed at me for nearly leaving a fortune buried under a flower bed. I didn't call anyone those first 2 days. I just sat with the box in the evenings after work, turning coins over one at a time under the kitchen light, feeling, for reasons I couldn't fully articulate, that I owed them at least that much attention before I let them go. The following Monday, I drove into town with the tin box on the passenger seat and parked outside Heinz Antiques and Curios, a narrow shop wedged between a hardware store and a shuttered diner on Larkspur Hollow's Main Street. I had walked past that shop for years without once going inside. A bell chimed above the door when I pushed it open, and the smell of old paper and furniture polish greeted me. Walter Heinz came out from a back room, a heavy-set man in his mid-60s with silver hair combed carefully to one side and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He had a warm, unhurried manner, the kind that puts a stranger at ease, and he greeted me by name before I'd even introduced myself, which I chalked up at the time to small-town familiarity. I set the tin box on his glass counter and told him I'd found it while gardening and had no idea what any of it was worth. He opened the lid, and something crossed his face that I would only understand much later. At the time, I read it as mild professional curiosity. He picked through the coins slowly, turning a few over in his fingers, holding 1 or 2 up to the light from the front window. The whole examination took perhaps 5 minutes. "Old stuff," he said finally, closing the lid. "Circulated coinage, mostly common dates. There's a market for scrap silver, but honestly, ma'am, most of this is going to melt value at best. I can offer you $60 for the lot. $60. I remember doing the math in my head against the property tax bill and feeling something between relief and defeat. It wouldn't fix anything, but it was $60 I hadn't had that morning. All right, I said. He wrote out a receipt, counted 3 20s into my hand, and slid the tin box beneath his counter. I drove home, made dinner, and thought nothing more of it, until Thursday morning, when my phone rang at 8:52. I remember the time because I was standing at my kitchen sink, and I glanced at the stove clock the way you do out of habit when a phone catches you off guard. The number wasn't saved in my contacts, but it had the local area code. Mrs. Ashby, a man's voice said, and it took me a moment to place it as Walter Hines. I'm sorry to call so early. Something's come up with the items you brought in Monday. I'd like you to come back to the shop if you're able. It's fairly urgent. I asked him what was wrong. He said he'd rather explain in person. There was something in his voice I couldn't quite name at the time, a careful, controlled quality, like a man reading from a script he'd rehearsed in the mirror. I told him I could be there within the half hour. On the drive over, I ran through a dozen small, mundane possibilities. Maybe there was a problem with the receipt. Maybe one of the coins had turned out to be counterfeit, and he needed a signature for some kind of record. Not once did it occur to me what was actually waiting on the other side of that shop's glass door. When I walked in, the bell chiming above me, Walter Hines was not alone. 2 men stood near the counter in dark, well-tailored suits, entirely out of place against the dusty shelves of old lamps and porcelain figurines. Both looked to be in their 50s, both carried the specific stillness of men accustomed to important conversations. I stopped just inside the door. Mrs. Ashby, Hines said, thank you for coming. These gentlemen are Mr. Thomas Reyes and Mr. Adrian Cole from Continental Rare Coin Exchange out of Nashville. They had some questions about the coins you brought in Monday. Thomas Reyes stepped forward and shook my hand, his grip firm, his manner the practiced calm of someone used to delivering large news carefully. Mrs. Ashby, he said, can I ask where these coins originally came from? Was this a family collection, or something you inherited? I told him the truth, that I dug them out of my own backyard while planting flowers, that I had no idea whatsoever what they were, or where they'd come from before that. He nodded slowly and exchanged a glance with his colleague that I felt rather than fully understood. I'll be direct with you, he said. Among the coins you sold, there is one piece that is extraordinarily significant. It's an 1870 seated Liberty silver dollar, minted at the San Francisco branch mint. Fewer than a dozen examples of that particular strike are confirmed to exist anywhere in the world. He let that sit for a moment before he continued. In the condition your coin is in, at a major numismatic auction, we would conservatively expect it to realize somewhere between $400,000 and $500,000. Combined with several other genuinely valuable pieces in that box, we believe the full collection could be worth in excess of $500,000 total. Adrian Cole, who had said nothing up to that point, opened a slim leather folder and turned it toward me, showing a photograph of a coin nearly identical to the one I'd handed over 2 days earlier, alongside auction records from firms I'd never heard of, figures with more zeros than I was prepared to look at directly. We don't say this lightly, Mrs. Ashby, he said. In 20 years in this business, I've personally handled maybe 3 coins of his caliber. This isn't a common surprise. This is close to the top of what exists in this entire category of American coinage. I don't fully remember what my face did in that moment, but I remember the room seeming to tilt slightly, the way a boat does when you shift your weight without warning. I'm sorry, I said. How much? Reyes repeated the figure, patiently, the way you'd repeat something to a person still catching up to the news. I looked at Walter Hines. He was not looking at me. He was looking at a display case of old pocket watches, his hands folded in front of him, his jaw set in a stillness that struck me, even in my shock, as rehearsed. I want my coins back, I said. It came out of me before I decided to say it, entirely without planning. Hines finally met my eyes. Mrs. Ashby, I understand this is a shock, but the sale was final. You signed a receipt. I asked him whether he'd known what the coins were when he bought them. I'm an antiques dealer, not a coin specialist, he said. I made a fair assessment based on what I know. That's simply how these transactions work. I drove home on something close to autopilot, and I don't remember a single turn of the route. I sat in my driveway for nearly 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. The number kept repeating in my head. $500,000. Against the property taxes, against the medical debt, against every quiet, grinding fear I'd been carrying since October, that number would have meant an entirely different life. And I had sold it for $60. That evening, sitting at my kitchen table, a colder thought settled in. Had Walter Hines known exactly what he was looking at the moment he opened that tin box? The 5 minutes that hadn't felt bored at all, in hindsight, but performed. The urgency of his call 2 days later, which made no sense at all if his intention was simply to correct an honest mistake, because a dishonest dealer with no legal exposure would have every reason to say nothing and quietly resell the coin himself. Unless he needed something from me. Unless there was a reason he couldn't simply keep it quiet. I spent that night searching online. Consumer protection law, fraudulent misrepresentation, Tennessee statutes on the sale of goods. By morning, I had an appointment with an attorney named Renee Castillo, whose office in the county seat specialized in consumer fraud and civil litigation, according to the paralegal who answered the phone. Renee Castillo's office was 40 minutes away, in a converted brick storefront with a small waiting room and the low hum of a space heater running even in spring. Renee herself was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed, with close-cropped hair and the unhurried attentiveness of someone who had learned, through long experience, exactly how much silence to leave before responding. I laid everything out for her. The garden, the tin box, the $60, the urgent phone call, the 2 men in suits, the number they'd named. She let me finish completely before she spoke. Do you still have the receipt? I did. I'd kept it folded in my purse since the day I signed it, some instinct refusing to let me throw it away, even before I understood why. She examined it carefully. In Tennessee, to prove fraudulent misrepresentation, we'd need to show Hines made a false statement of fact, that he knew it was false at the time, and that you reasonably relied on it to your detriment, she said. The hard part in cases like this is always proving what the seller actually knew. He'll say he had no idea what he was looking at, and that it was an honest, good-faith offer. Can I prove he's lying? I asked. That depends entirely on what we find, she said. That's where we start. Write down everything you remember from both visits, every detail, no matter how small. And I want you to think carefully about anything odd Hines said or did, anything that seemed rehearsed. She also asked me a question I hadn't expected, whether Michael or I had ever had any prior dealings with Walter Hines, whether he might have known anything at all about our property before that Monday. I told her, as far as I knew, we'd never exchanged more than a nod at the hardware store. She wrote that down too, underlined it, and told me that in cases like this, the story almost always turns out to be older than the transaction itself, that a man rarely stumbles into knowing the exact value of a stranger's buried coins by pure accident. That evening I filled 4 pages of a notebook. The next step Renee suggested was slower and less dramatic than I'd imagined legal investigation would be. She told me to look into whether Walter Hines had any prior connection to my property, any reason he might have known, before I ever walked through his door, what could be buried in that backyard. She also suggested I visit the County Historical Society, since old land records and family journals sometimes surface surprising details about a property's history. It took me the better part of a week, working evenings after my shifts at the nursery, learning names and terms I'd never encountered before. Seated Liberty Dollar, Branch Mint, numismatic grading. And then, on a Wednesday evening, going through digitized county records at the Historical Society with a volunteer archivist named Priscilla Doyle, I found something that stopped me cold. The house Michael and I had bought 31 years earlier had, generations before that, belonged to a family named Hines. According to the property transfer records, a farmer named Elias Hines had owned that land in the early 20th century before losing it in a foreclosure during the banking panic of 1933. Priscilla, who had lived in Larkspur Hollow her whole life and seemed to know every family story worth knowing, mentioned almost offhandedly that there had long been a rumor in town that Elias Hines had buried a portion of his savings on the property rather than lose it to the failing banks, a rumor nobody had ever confirmed. I sat very still at that library table. Walter Hines, Elias Hines. I asked Priscilla, as casually as I could manage, whether she knew if Walter Hines had any family connection to that name. She thought for a moment and said that yes. Actually, she believed Walter's grandfather had been Elias's son, and that the family had talked about the lost farm for decades. She also mentioned, almost as an aside, that Walter had come into the Historical Society himself about 4 months earlier, asking to see old land records and family papers connected to that very property. Priscilla, sensing how shaken I was, pulled one more thing for me before I left that evening. A digitized 1934 edition of the Larkspur Hollow Sentinel, the town's long-defunct weekly newspaper, with a short item buried on the 3rd page reporting that Elias Hines had lost his farm to foreclosure that January, the 3rd such loss along the Eastern Turnpike this winter alone, the article noted, as area banks continue to call in notes amid the ongoing crisis. There was no mention of buried money in the paper, of course, nothing so tidy as that, but the date lined up exactly with the family rumor Priscilla had described, and holding that brittle, yellowed page in my hands, I understood for the first time that whoever had wrapped those coins in canvas and buried them near the fence line had done it out of the same kind of fear I recognized in myself, the fear of losing everything to a system that didn't care what happened to you afterward. I forwarded everything to Renee that night, the property records, the archivist's account, the old newspaper clipping, and the visitor log showing Walter Hines had requested those specific documents months before I'd ever set foot in his shop. She called me the next morning, and even over the phone I could hear a shift in her voice, a focused energy she hadn't shown before. "This is significant," she said. "Not conclusive on its own, but significant. If he had reason to believe there was buried family money on that property before you ever walked in, that changes the picture of what he knew and when he knew it. What I did not know yet, what I would only learn much later, was that in the back office of Hines Antiques and Curios, a very different conversation was already underway. Walter's nephew, Dale Hines, 31 years old and the shop's part-time bookkeeper, had been the one who dug through the old family papers with his uncle months earlier, tracing the story of the lost farm their family had talked about at holiday dinners for 2 generations. The day after Renee sent a formal preservation letter to the shop, Dale told his uncle plainly, "She's got a lawyer now. I think she's found the connection." Renee filed the civil complaint on a Tuesday in early June. It named Walter Hines as the sole defendant, alleging fraudulent misrepresentation and unjust enrichment, and it sought the return of the coins along with damages for their lost value and for emotional distress. I honestly don't know precisely when the paperwork reached him, but it must have moved rather fast, because that Saturday morning I looked out my kitchen window to find a gray pickup truck idling at the curb in front of my house. I remember standing at the sink with a dish towel still in my hand, watching the truck sit there for almost a full minute before the engine finally cut, and feeling a strange, cold certainty settle over me before I even saw who climbed out, the specific instinct you develop after enough hard years that trouble has its own particular stillness, its own way of parking itself outside your window and waiting. I didn't recognize the young man who climbed out until he introduced himself. Dale Hines was tall, broad through the shoulders, with his uncle's same pale, watchful eyes set in a younger face. He wore work boots and a flannel shirt, and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who expected to be listened to. I met him on the porch rather than let him come to the door. "Mrs. Ashby," he said, stopping at the base of my steps. "I thought maybe we could talk, just the two of us." I told him any communication needed to go through my attorney. He made a small, patient sound, almost a laugh. "I get that you're upset," he said, "but you need to understand what you're actually doing here. You're suing a family business that's been in this town for 3 generations. You signed a receipt. You accepted payment freely. Now some lawyers got you thinking there's a fortune to be made off a technicality." $500,000 isn't a technicality, I said. "It's what your uncle already knew those coins were worth before he offered me 60. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite anger, not quite calculation, something between the two. "My uncle's an antiques dealer, not a certified coin grader," he said. "He made a reasonable offer in good faith. That's the law, Mrs. Ashby. That's literally the law." "Then you have nothing to worry about," I said. He set one boot on the bottom porch step, not climbing, just a small shift in posture that felt, in the moment, like a kind of pressure. "I'm trying to save you some real trouble here," he said. "This is going to cost you money you don't have. We'll counter for harassment. We'll drag this out 2 years in court, and at the end of it you'll have spent more than the coins were ever worth just to prove a point." He paused, his voice dropping lower. "You just buried your husband. You've got real bills piling up. Is this really how you want to spend the next 2 years of your life?" That was the moment I understood exactly who I was dealing with and what he had come to my home to do. "Get off my property," I said. "I mean that literally. Take your foot off my step." He held my eyes a beat longer than was comfortable, then stepped back, said, "Think carefully," and walked to his truck. I watched him drive away before I went inside, sat at my kitchen table, and wrote down every word of the conversation while it was still fresh. I called Renee that evening and read her my notes. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, her voice had that same focused quality. "This is actually useful to us," she said. "Unauthorized contact with a represented party and a fairly clear attempt at intimidation. I'm documenting this formally. Send me everything you wrote tonight." The following week, Renee filed an additional motion noting the visit, which prompted a call from Walter's own attorney, a measured older man named Gordon Reeve, asking her to rein in her client's aggression, as though I had been the one showing up uninvited at someone's home. 2 weeks later, a settlement offer arrived by certified mail. $5,000, in exchange for full and final release of any claim, along with a mutual non-disparagement clause that would keep me from ever speaking about the transaction publicly. I stood in my hallway holding that letter for a long time, thinking about what $5,000 would actually do. It would clear the tax debt. It would quiet the medical collectors for a while. It would end the lawyers, the visits, the sleepless nights of feeling watched in my own small town. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't tempted, but I sat with the number long enough to do a simple piece of arithmetic. Continental Rare Coin Exchange had said the collection could be worth over $500,000. Walter Hines was offering me $5,000, 1% of that figure, in exchange for my permanent silence. A man does not pay you to be quiet about something worthless. I called Renee and told her to decline. "Good," she said. "I'll send the rejection today." It was around this time that I finally reached out to the Larkspur Hollow Heritage and Coin Society, a small local club I'd heard mentioned at the nursery, but never thought much about. Michael had never belonged to it, but a longtime customer named Vernon Truitt, hearing my story secondhand from a mutual friend, suggested I might find people there who could actually help. I called the club's president, a retired schoolteacher named Arthur Bellamy, who listened to my entire story on the phone without interruption, and then invited me to the club's next meeting in the back room of the county library. I went the following Thursday, half expecting a handful of hobbyists with magnifying glasses. Instead, I found 16 members, ranging from teenagers with binders of pocket change to a woman in her 70s who had spent 40 years collecting territorial gold pieces. Vernon Truitt was there too, sitting near the back, giving me a small nod of encouragement when I walked in that steadied my nerves more than he probably realized. A younger member, a machinist named Danny Ferris who mostly collected wheat pennies, leaned over at one point and whispered that his own grandfather used to talk about the Hines family and their lost farm, that it was practically local legend among the old-timers, which only confirmed how widely known that particular story had been for anyone willing to go looking for it. When I finished telling my story around their folding table, the room went quiet, and then Arthur Bellamy spoke. Arthur was 71, precise in his movements, with the careful hands of a man who had spent decades appraising delicate things. He had, several members later told me, consulted for regional auction houses for most of his career. "I'd like to examine photographs of what you found, if you have any," he said. "And if what you're describing holds up, I would be honored to write a formal appraisal and to testify if this goes to trial." I had taken photographs of the coins before I ever brought them to Hines, almost as an afterthought, the kind of instinct that later felt like it had been placed there for a reason. Arthur's written appraisal arrived at Renee's office 2 weeks later, running to 11 pages with detailed notes and comparable auction results, identifying the seated Liberty dollar and several other pieces in the collection, and placing a conservative combined value of just over $510,000. Renee called it, only half joking, the kind of document that makes opposing counsel reconsider their weekend plans. Walter Hines, I have no doubt, was informed of it quickly, because the following Sunday afternoon he came to my house himself, and this time he did not come alone. I was in the backyard, working on the half-finished flower bed that had started all of this, when I heard a car door. I came around the side of the house to find Walter Hines standing at my gate with Dale beside him, holding a paper bag from the bakery on Main Street like an offering. "Nora," Walter said, using my first name in a way that felt calculated rather than familiar. "I hope you don't mind us stopping by. I brought some pastries." I felt like we owed each other a real conversation, one neighbor to another. I stayed on my side of the gate. "My attorney is Renee Castillo," I said. "All communication goes through her." He made a small, regretful sound. "I know that's how it has to be, officially. I just felt like this had all gotten so formal, so fast, between two people who've lived in the same town for 30 years. "What do you want, Walter?" I asked. He set the bakery bag on my fence post. "I want to make this right," he said. "I've talked to my lawyer, and I know how ugly this could get for both of us if it goes to trial. I'm prepared to offer you $20,000. I know it's less than what the enthusiasts are claiming, but those appraisals are always optimistic. Auction results vary wildly. Grading disputes happen constantly. $20,000. Right now, no lawyers, no stress. $20,000. More than the first offer. Still less than 4% of what his own knowledge had told him it was worth. "No," I said. Dale shifted his weight beside him. Walter's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A coldness settling in under the warmth. "Nora," he said, more quietly, "I think you're underestimating how hard a trial is going to be for you. And I should mention, some of Michael's business debts are likely to come up in discovery. Unpaid supplier invoices, a loan from a private party that was never fully documented. I don't think you want that becoming public record in this town, and I don't think Michael would want it either." There it was, the same cold thing Dale had used on my porch step weeks earlier, dressed now in a softer voice. I had known it was coming, and knowing it did not make it land any softer when it did. My chest tightened, and something hot rose in my throat, but I breathed through it, one slow breath, the way Renee had taught me. "Michael's finances will be handled fully and honestly in court," I said. "He was a decent, hard-working man for 31 years, and I am not afraid of anything discovery finds." "Are you?" Walter looked at me for a long moment, and the last of the friendly warmth went out of his face entirely. What remained looked older than it had a minute before, calculating, the pale eyes flat. "You should think carefully," he said, the exact phrase Dale had used at my porch steps weeks earlier. "I have thought carefully," I said. "Please leave my property." Dale took a half step forward, not quite threatening, but pointed. "You're making a mistake," he said. "That's my right," I answered. They left, Walter picking the bakery bag back up as he went, pausing once at the end of my driveway to look back at me before climbing into his car. I waited until they were out of sight before I let myself shake, just my hands, for a few minutes at my kitchen table, the physical release of adrenaline I hadn't allowed myself to show. Then I called Renee and gave her every detail, the bakery bag, the $20,000, the specific mention of Michael's private debts. She wrote it all down and told me it was the second documented incident of unauthorized contact, and that the reference to private, undocumented information about Michael's finances raised its own separate concern about how Walter had come to know it. "They're frightened," she said. "This is what frightened people do. It tells you the ground under your case is solid." I slept better that night than I had in weeks. The trial was set for a Wednesday in late September, almost exactly 1 year after Michael's diagnosis had first turned our lives upside down, a symmetry I noticed and said nothing about to anyone. The county courthouse was a squat limestone building I had passed 1,000 times without ever going inside, and the courtroom itself carried the particular hush of a place where ordinary lives get weighed in careful, formal language. Renee sat beside me at the plaintiff's table, calm and precise, and I kept my hands folded in my lap and breathed slowly the way she taught me. Gordon Reeve, Walter's attorney, opened with exactly the argument Renee had predicted he would. Walter Hines was an antiques dealer, not a certified numismatist. He had made a good faith assessment. The transaction had been entered into freely, with a signed receipt, and the matter should end there. It was a reasonable argument, and it might have been enough against a weaker case. Renee opened with Arthur Bellamy. He took the stand in a dark suit, spoke with the unhurried precision of a man who had spent 40 years being exactly right about small, valuable objects, and explained to the jury what an 1870-seated Liberty dollar was, why so few examples existed, and why any experienced dealer examining that coin for even a few minutes would have recognized something requiring immediate further investigation. No dealer with real experience in American coinage looks at that piece for 5 minutes and sincerely believes the whole lot is worth $60, he said. Gordon Reeve cross-examined him at length. Arthur did not waver. Then Renee moved to the property records. Reeve objected on grounds of relevance. Judge Colette Renner, a measured woman in her 50s who had clearly read every filing in advance, overruled him and allowed the county archive documents into evidence. Renee walked the jury through the history of the land, the Hines family's connection to it, the rumor of buried money that had circulated in Larkspur Hollow for nearly a century, and the Historical Society's visitor log showing that Walter Hines had personally requested access to those exact family records 4 months before I ever walked into his shop. She then introduced an email obtained during discovery, sent from Walter's shop account to Continental Rare Coin Exchange 11 days before my first visit. The subject line read simply, "Family land, possible historical find," and the body of the message asked, in Walter's own words, whether the firm could advise on what an old-seated Liberty dollar from a specific regional mint might realistically be worth, and whether they'd be willing to send a representative to town on short notice if something turned up. The firm had replied the following morning, providing a rough valuation range and confirming they could send someone within days. When Walter took the stand, his careful preparation was obvious in his measured, unhurried answers. Yes, he'd researched his family's old property out of general curiosity. No, he hadn't specifically expected to find anything on Nora Ashby's land. The email to Continental Rare Coin. Well, he made inquiries like that from time to time. It was common practice in the trade. Renee approached with the printed email in hand. Mr. Hines, this email is dated 11 days before Mrs. Ashby brought you her coins. Is that correct? He agreed it was. You asked specifically about a seeded Liberty dollar from a regional mint, the exact type of coin Mrs. Ashby brought into your shop 11 days later. How did you know to ask about that specific coin before you had ever seen it? A long pause followed, the kind that fills an entire courtroom. I'd heard family stories, Walter finally said, about coins possibly buried on the old property. I was curious, that's all. I didn't know for certain anything would come of it. So your testimony, Renee said, is that you had specific reason to believe valuable historical coins might be buried on Mrs. Ashby's land based on your own family's history, and you contacted a rare coin firm to establish their value 11 days before she happened to bring you exactly that kind of coin, and yet you offered her $60 for the entire collection without mentioning any of this. Reeve objected to the form of the question. Judge Renner sustained it and asked Renee to rephrase, but the question had already landed, and it did not leave the room. Dale was called next. He had prepared more carefully than his uncle, younger and steadier under questioning, insisting he had simply helped his uncle research family history out of personal interest and had no specific expectation about Nora Ashby's property. Renee had one document for him, an internal text message, recovered from his phone during discovery, sent to Walter the same day the Continental Rare Coin Exchange reply arrived. It read in full, Uncle W., this is bigger than I thought. What's the plan if she brings something in? Dale went very still on the stand. Is this your phone number? Renee asked. He confirmed it was. Is this your uncle's number? He confirmed that too. The courtroom was completely silent. Gordon Reeve made one final attempt on redirect, asking Walter to clarify that family stories about buried money were common in old farming communities and rarely amounted to anything concrete. That curiosity about one's own family history was not the same as deliberate fraud. Walter answered carefully, agreeing that most such stories never panned out, that he genuinely believed the odds were slim. Renee, on recross, asked only one further question. Mr. Hines, if you genuinely believe the odds were slim, why did you contact a professional rare coin firm and ask them to be prepared to send a representative to town on short notice? He had no answer that satisfied the room, and Judge Renner made a small note on her legal pad that I noticed even from the plaintiff's table, the kind of note that told me, before the verdict ever came, which way this was going to fall. Judge Renner delivered her ruling from the bench 2 days later, without a lengthy recess, in the same measured voice she'd used throughout the proceedings. The court finds, she said, that the defendant, Walter Hines, made a knowing and materially false statement regarding the value of the coins purchased from the plaintiff at a time when he possessed specific information suggesting those coins were likely to include historically significant, high-value pieces. The court finds this misrepresentation was intended to induce the plaintiff's reliance, and that she did rely on it to her substantial financial detriment. She ordered the immediate return of every coin in the original tin box, along with compensatory damages of $62,000 for documented financial harm, legal costs, and emotional distress, and referred the matter to the state's licensing board for antiques and secondhand dealers, along with a separate referral to the county prosecutor's office for review of possible criminal fraud charges. There was a moment of stillness in the courtroom, and then Walter's carefully composed face seemed to loosen all at once, not dramatically, just a quiet collapse into something older and more tired than the man who had walked in that morning. Renee touched my forearm briefly. Well done, she said quietly. The tin box was released from evidence within the week, and I drove to Renee's office to collect it myself, holding it on my lap in the car for a long moment before I could make myself drive home. Inside were the ordinary coins Michael and I would never have thought twice about, the worn copper pieces, the common silver, and nestled among them, the seeded Liberty dollar that had started everything, along with 2 other coins Arthur later identified as genuinely rare regional gold pieces from the same era. Renee connected me with a reputable rare coin auction house in Charlotte, and the consignment process took about 6 weeks between grading, photography, and catalog placement. The seeded Liberty Dollar was independently graded and listed with an estimate between $400,000 and $480,000. It ultimately sold for $441,000. Combined with the 2 smaller gold pieces, and after auction fees and Renee's costs, which she quietly reduced because, as she told me, this was one of the more satisfying cases of her career, I walked away with just over $465,000. I flew to Charlotte for the auction itself, something I never would have imagined myself doing a year earlier, and sat in a hushed room watching a number climb on a screen faster than I could track it, my hands folded so tightly in my lap that Renee, sitting beside me, gently reminded me to breathe. When the gavel came down, I felt none of the triumph I'd expected. I felt, instead, a strange, quiet grief, thinking of Michael, of how much he would have loved sitting in that room with me, running commentary under his breath the way he did at estate sales, and how unfair it felt that the one thing solid enough to finally steady our life had arrived 5 months after he was no longer there to see it. I did not sell everything. A handful of the more ordinary coins I kept, along with the rusted tin box itself, which now sits, cleaned and lined with fresh felt, on a shelf in my living room beside a framed copy of Michael's butterfly garden sketch. The garden, incidentally, got finished that fall. I hired a young landscaper Michael had once mentored to lay it out exactly as he'd drawn it, and by the following spring the eastern fence line was thick with milkweed and coneflower, and monarchs came, the way Michael had always promised they would. As for Walter Hines, the state licensing board revoked his dealer's certification that winter after its own investigation turned up 2 additional transactions involving elderly sellers, in which he had purchased items well below documented market value with evidence of prior knowledge of their worth. The county prosecutor's office ultimately declined to pursue criminal charges, citing his age and lack of prior record, a decision that frustrated me for a while until Renee reminded me that a civil judgment of this size carries its own weight in a small town, and that she was right about that more often than not. Hines Antiques and Curios closed within 4 months of the verdict. The building sat empty through the following spring before a new tenant took the lease. Dale lost his position managing accounts for a regional supply company shortly after the ruling became public record, once his employer's standard background check turned it up. I neither engineered that outcome nor mourned it particularly. Public records, as it turns out, have a very long memory in a town the size of Larkspur Hollow. I paid off the property taxes in full that October, standing at the counter of the county assessor's office and watching the balance zero out on the screen. I paid off every remaining medical collection notice with certified checks, each one confirmed in writing by Renee's office, because I wanted every last trace of that particular fear scrubbed permanently out of my life. I paid the house off outright, in my name alone, the house Michael and I had shared for 31 years, free and clear for the first time since we bought it. With what remained, I did a few things that mattered to me. I established the Michael Ashby Memorial Garden Scholarship at the County Community College, awarded each year to a student studying horticulture or landscape design, and Arthur Bellamy and several members of the Coin Society came to the small ceremony where I announced it. I had Arthur properly catalog the remaining coins from the tin box, each one housed now in an archival case with a written note about where and how it was found, a strange little record of a mystery that had, in its own roundabout way, honored the very garden Michael never lived to finish. And I joined the Larkspur Hollow Heritage and Coin Society as a full member, not because I became any kind of expert, but because I wanted to stay close to the people who had believed me before anyone had reason to. Arthur and I have coffee most Wednesday mornings now, usually at the diner 2 doors down from where Hines Antiques used to be, and neither of us ever mentions the empty storefront across the street, though I catch him glancing at it sometimes the way you glance at an old scar. Vernon Truitt, the customer from the nursery who first pointed me toward the Coin Society, still stops by the shop every week to ask how the flower bed is coming along, and Danny Ferris brought his young son by one Saturday just to see the monarchs, standing at the fence line with the same quiet wonder Michael used to have watching something grow exactly the way he'd planned it. My daughter, Callie, came home this past Christmas with her fiancé, and for the first time in 2 years, I wasn't doing arithmetic in my head over the cost of the meal, and I finally told her the truth about how bad those months before the flower bed had really been, and she cried a little, and then she laughed, and said her father would have found the whole thing unbearably funny, $60 and a shovel changing everything. I think about Walter Hines sometimes, not often, and never with much heat left in it. What he and Dale never understood, standing on my porch steps telling me to think carefully, was that they had read me as an easy target, a grieving widow with no money and no allies, and they had been wrong about nearly every part of that. I think, too, about the family that buried those coins nearly a century ago, frightened enough by a collapsing bank to trust the ground under their own feet more than any institution. They never got to dig them back up. Elias Hines died, according to the old county records, only 6 years after losing that farm, and I sometimes wonder if he thought about that buried tin box in his final years, whether he ever hoped one of his own grandchildren might return to that land one day and set things right. In a strange way, one of them tried, though not in any manner Elias would have recognized as honorable. Some quiet evenings now, when I'm out working alone in the finished butterfly garden, watching the orange and black monarchs move slowly and patiently between the coneflowers the way Michael always promised they eventually would, I think about how close I came to letting that whole story stay buried. $60 in a closed tin box, no different from any other quiet defeat in a hard year. It would have been so easy to let it end there. I think about that stubborn refusal more than I think about the money itself. Honestly, most days, the fact that some small, stubborn part of me refused to let a closed lid be the final word. Michael always used to say that most gardens quietly fail not because the soil itself is wrong, but simply because someone gives up on them one season too early. I didn't know, when I finally picked up that shovel, that I would end up proving him right about something so much larger than flowers. In the end, though, it turned out their fear became someone else's second chance, buried quietly under a half-finished flower bed, waiting for a shovel that finally, after all those years, found its way home.